let's get started on the last panel, probably the most important kind of conclusory panel. And for that, I turn it over to the wonderful Steve McMahon.
Thank you.
The one and only.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Boy, it's very exciting. How's everybody feeling this morning? Gentlemen, ladies? Okay, so our panel today, this morning, is sort of the look-ahead panel. What's going to happen next, to the extent that anybody can predict it? Because, you know, in America these days, in politics, you wake up every morning and you get this thing called Playbook, which sort of tells you what's going on in Washington. And usually it reports on Donald Trump's 3 tweets that morning. And oftentimes you just find yourself scratching your head saying, I can't believe he did this. And it becomes the day's news. So to the extent we can, we're going to try to project forward past the president's next tweet and into 2018 and 2020, or 2020, I guess. And we've got a great panel here. Their bios are all included in your handouts. Many of them yesterday were on panels, so you heard from them some yesterday, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Todd, you're one of the premier Republican strategists and media consultants in the world.
In the universe.
In the universe. It's a pretty big accomplishment.
Known and unknown.
What would you say is the state of the Republican Party today, and how would you characterize the 2018 cycle as you look at it today in terms of the likelihood of Republicans holding both the House and the Senate?
The state of the Republican Party today, ironically, because obviously we control, we control everything in Washington, and yet the party itself is rudderless. You have competing competing factions, competing groups who are pulling the party in different directions. We talked a little bit yesterday about how both political parties have a great ability to always learn the wrong lessons from the previous election. So you have a lot of people continuing to argue over what it is that put Trump in the White House, and whether the Republican Party should double down on what we'll sort of call Trumpism, or whether that was an anomaly, that was a blip, and the Republican Party should sort of reconstitute itself and refocus on those core center-right principles that have been kind of the unifying theory or concept of the party for the last several generations. People talk a lot about, are we the party of Ronald Reagan anymore? And that's a question that, even just a few election cycles ago, it's not even a question that would have been asked, because everyone, you would assume the answer would be yes. It would be like saying, does the sun continue to rise in the east? But it is a legitimate question today. Personally, I would like to see the party return to sort of a more hopeful, optimistic, uplifting, center-right ideology. There are, as I say, there are a lot of those now who are ascendant in the party who have different views. So where that leaves us in 2018 is anybody's guess. And I have a lot of clients whose names will be on the ballot in 2018, and I can't say with certainty for any of them what our general election messaging next year is going to be, at least in those states, in more purple states. I know already, if you're running in Alabama, I have a pretty good sense. We do the governor in Alabama. I can tell you what our reelection message next year will be in Alabama. can't tell you what it will be in Michigan or Wisconsin or some of the other places where we do races. The final point that I'll make is it's always, you look at, there are a lot of canaries in the coal mines in politics, and one of them that you look at these days a lot is just how much organic online engagement do your candidates have, and which candidates have the highest levels of organic engagement in social media. And right now the most enthusiasm, it's all centered around Trump, either pro-Trump on the Republican side, or in the case of what we see with Democrat candidates, those that take the most strident anti-Trump positions seem to be having the highest levels of enthusiasm. And so that does not portend well for anyone who was hoping next year would be more of a return to normalcy, because I think what you're going to see is, instead of the country moving to heal some of those divisions, I think they're becoming a bit deeper.
John Anzalone, it's your time in the barrel, my friend. So many of you may know this, some of you may not. John was one of the principal pollsters with Joel Benenson for Hillary Clinton's campaign. And Hillary Clinton's campaign was a campaign that disappointed a lot of people. Donald Trump's election disappointed them more.
John's performance.
Yes.
Not John's performance. John is a great pollster and a great friend. My question for John, though, is this: because just as the Republican Party was, I would say, it was a hostile takeover by Donald Trump of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party had its own internal war going on with the Bernie Sanders people. And what they regarded to be as a fight against the Democratic establishment represented by Hillary Clinton and her folks. And I guess what I'd like to ask you is, what do you think going forward into 2018 and 2020, do you think that those divisions that sort of were fostered and grew during the campaign, and that we see a little bit today, are going to continue, or do you think the Democratic Party is going to be able to get it together in 2018, put a unified message and team on the field? And do you think the Sanders influence is a healthy influence for the party in terms of its ability to win, or do you think it's destructive?
Right. Well, first, it's interesting what Todd was talking about his party. And I think the honest answer is everyone is off balance, right? I mean, Trump has thrown us off balance. Bernie threw us off balance because I don't think there was ever the expectation that he would actually come that close, right, of overtaking Hillary in the primary. And so everyone is out of sorts, and in a way trying to figure out not only who they are as a party, both parties, but also how to move forward in terms of communicating to general election voters, right, which really is what matters. You can have a nominee. We have all these governor's races, Senate races, legislative races, congressional races. And I think we talked about it yesterday. The byproduct of Trump is that there are so many people running. In every governor's race, we have 5 or 6 really good candidates. In every congressional race, we have 5 or 6 good candidates. And that's like a blessing because democracy is good. And it's a curse because what happens? They're going to go after each other. And this breach between kind of, far left, Bernie brothers and centrist, just kind of pragmatic Democrats who are just running because, it's either the next step or they feel a calling. There's going to be a lot of resources used in Democratic primaries all over the place. And then, of course, on their side, you have Steve Bannon, who's recruiting all these far right to run against incumbent Republicans. So the primaries are going to take on something so significant and important in this election cycle that we really haven't seen in a long, long time, maybe since the 70s, kind of post-Nixon. And on the Democratic side, you're going to see that with, again, the Bernie brothers, and not so much the Hillary people. They're just establishment Democrats. I think our challenge in our party is to understand that we have a really big tent. And I'm not saying, oh, Republicans are just a bunch of white guys, but they have they have an easier time because guess what? They're 85% a bunch of white guys, but and white women. So, but we have a big tent, and it's not it's white. On both sides of the coast, it's white liberals, it's white moderates, it's African Americans. Within the African American Democrats, you have this kind of civil rights era members, and then you have the kind of the new era, the Cory Bookers of the world. I mean, we have Clyburn from South Carolina and Booker. They don't have a lot in common, even though they're African American, legislators, in terms of their approach and where they came from. And then you have this this growing Latino population within our caucus too. And guess what? It's really diverse. You have, Luis Gutierrez, who's Puerto Rican and independence guy, and you have, Mexican Americans, and then all of a sudden you're having from, elected officials from all over, originating from South America, et cetera. My point being is that there is this myth that there's some unifying message for the Democratic Party. And what I caution our party is that, guess what? We have to let Democrats from all over the country, where they are, find their value set from their region or their district, find the issues that are important, and wrap around an important Democratic message that touches and impacts voters in a way that is reliable and credible for them. Because let me just tell you, an economic message in the suburbs of Georgia, where it's high income and high education, income inequality isn't that message there. It's not Midland, Ohio, right? What I'm saying? It's not, Ottumwa, Iowa, where they've lost everything. And so there just tends to be this myth that we can have a unifying message. And that, to me, is the destructive part of someone like Bernie Sanders, who I actually don't believe cares about the Democratic Party. And I don't think that he wakes up every day and says that unifying the Democratic Party and making us successful and getting the House and the Senate and the presidency is what he wants to do. And so in that sense, I think the schism is very, very difficult. He's very much like Bannon. And I don't think anyone's really pointed this out. Bannon doesn't give a shit about the Republican Party. He wants to destroy it. Yeah. Bernie, I don't think, quite frankly, gives a shit about the Democratic Party. He cares about himself, and he's not interested in building it. He's interested in making a bunch of points and principles. And I think that is detrimental to the Democratic Party. We won the House the last time on the backs of Southern white guys like Travis Childers in Mississippi and Bobby Bright in Alabama and Charlie Melanson in Louisiana and Heath Shuler in North Carolina. That's how Nancy Pelosi became Speaker, is that we had, at that point, the Blue Dogs, probably a good 15 members in the South. And I don't think we have any now. I think Barrow losing in Georgia, they're gone. We can't have a majority and a Speaker of the House without people who can talk to their electorates in places. And it's not just the South. It could be Will County, Illinois, which is a pretty conservative place. It could be the western front of Colorado, which used to have a Democratic senator, John Salazar. So again, that's the difficulty, are these litmus tests going into 2018.
Ron Christie, in 2016, you were responsible for doing debate prep for John Kasich in the primaries. Will you be doing debate prep for John Kasich in 2020?
I hope so. I think, good morning to you all, but first and foremost, and thank you for coming out for the last panel. It's early. You guys have many other things to do, and we really appreciate your zeal and your interest in politics. So first and foremost, thank you all for being here. I hope so, Steve. I hope that looking forward and looking at a path upon which the true Republican Party, not the Trump Party, but the true Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of Ronald Reagan, as Todd referenced a few moments ago, will wake out of its collective slumber and get its act together. We have been fractured for so many years now, and as I said yesterday, what happened in the last election reminds me so much of 1912. In 1912, I always look to the past to look to the future as a prediction of future behavior. What did you have in 1912? You had Taft, who was running for re-election. You had Woodrow Wilson, who was sort of on the fringe and kind of out of nowhere, and then you had Theodore Roosevelt, who decided that he wanted to run on the Bull Moose Party and to take down his former mentor and friend in the form of Taft. So what did Roosevelt do? Roosevelt split the vote, and Woodrow Wilson found his way into the White House, not Taft, as many had predicted, and not Roosevelt. And here you have Donald Trump in the last election, who, in a field of 17 candidates, and no one really took him seriously, thought, oh, Donald Trump, it's just Donald, and doing debate prep, Steve, and being in the green room, as Todd's done, and we've all been there, and you watch the dynamics, and you can see that the candidates slowly realize of, holy, we're going to lose this thing to that guy. And that was our dynamic of week after week, month after month of being in the green room and realizing that it was slipping away from us. And the reason I bring up 1912 is that Republicans would be wise to look at, of course, what happened in 1992, as I mentioned yesterday, of George H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton, a president who never got more than a plurality of the electoral votes in both his election and subsequent re-election, because there were other forces that were at play that allowed him to squeak past. If the Republican Party, the party that Todd and I love, the party that we grew up in, doesn't get its act together and find a way to say, here's a clear message, a clear path forward, then the Trumpian forces that, and I agree with you, John, absolutely. I don't think that Bernie or that Trump give a flying hoot about the respective parties that they claim that they represent. They represent their own ego, their own self-gratification, and their own path forward, but yet Bernie and Trump tapped into something that Republicans would be wise to recognize, which is disgust with the establishment, disgust with the status quo, and a yearning for something different. And they were both extraordinarily successful in channeling that energy and that spirit to catapult Trump to the top and Bernie nearly to bring down Hillary Clinton, which I found astounding.
If I could just add something that to build on what Ron was just saying, I think it's important as we look forward to keep what happened in 2016, to keep it in the proper perspective and put it in the right context. Trump's approval rating nationally today, it always hovers, between like 35 and 42%. If you look at his vote share in the string of primaries where I was working for Rubio, Ron was with Kasich, and Rob Collins, who is somewhere around here, was with Jeb. We all worked very, very hard to try to keep Donald Trump from being the nominee. But if you look at his vote share during the 2016 primary process, it was always hovering right around a third. And so the path to victory, what we believed our path to victory was going to be, and it would have been similar for Team Kasich and Team Jeb. You had these 17 candidates. The problem was about a dozen of them were really, really good candidates. This was not like 2008 or even 2012 where you had, a couple of marquee candidates and then a bunch of losers. This was like, whatever you think of Marco Rubio or John Kasich or Chris Christie or Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, these are all legit heavy hitters. And so what happened was you had this pie of the Republican base or the Republican primary electorate, and it was divided up 17 ways, except one of those slices was made out of titanium, and that was Trump's. And he had about a third, never really more than that. And the assumption that every campaign made was, well, as soon as all those other guys drop out, exactly right, I will be able to coalesce the 2/3 that is the not Trump vote. And we had a great plan to do that we just really needed John Kasich to drop out and Jeb Bush to drop out and Ted Cruz to drop out. And they all had great plans to do it. They really needed Marco Rubio to drop out. And someone asked yesterday, like, or maybe it was the day before, I can't remember, like, why wasn't there we talked about the smoke-filled rooms. Why wasn't there like the smoke-filled room where someone said, okay, you guys need to keep this from happening? And it wasn't that those conversations didn't exist. It's just that everyone thought that somebody else should be the one to get out of the way.
Jonathan Capehart, Washington Post, J. Newton Small, longtime Time magazine writer and contributor today. The unsettling nature of the political environment today didn't just affect the campaigns, it also affected or seems to have affected both the way campaigns are covered and the way that coverage is perceived. With Trump attacking the media routinely and calling what you do fake news or fake columns, how do you think that has impacted both the coverage broadly, not your coverage necessarily, but I'd love to hear about that as well, and how that coverage is received? Do you think that people out there trust the media to the same degree that they did? And what's the answer for that moving forward?
No, really, go.
All right. What was striking to me, I think, for this campaign, I covered Hillary on this side, and I'd covered her in 2008 as well. I did all Democrats in 2008, and then my very first campaign was John Kerry in 2004. And when I first got to sign John Kerry in the summer of 2003, it was weeks after like half of his staff had quit, and everyone thought that he was going to drop out. And Bloomberg was like, I was like the youngest person on the team, and they were like, you'll have this nice experience. It'll be like a few months in the campaign trail, and then he'll drop out, and that'll be it. And I ended up going all the way with him. But to me, that was striking because there was money to do that, right? Like Bloomberg had money to travel me in the summer of 2003, more than a year in advance of the election. I traveled for almost 23 months straight, in the 2008 election, 2007, 2008. And we had campaign plans for Obama and Hillary in the summer of 2007. So, more than a year before the actual election. We didn't travel with these candidates full time with a campaign plan until 3 or 4 months before the election this time around, because nobody could afford it. Like no one could afford it. The resources that journalists have this time, or now in general, is really dwindling. I mean, Time just shut down its entire Asia operation, which tells you something. I mean, we have nobody in China, we have nobody in Japan, which is terrifying. And so there's not the resources to do the kind of investigations that we used to do. And that, I think, especially in this era, is really, really worrisome because it's really hard to hold people accountable when you can't afford to look into what they're doing and sort of dig deep. And so, and I think that a lot of the stories, a lot of the potential accountability on Trump, were lost because we just didn't have the resources to really dig in. For example, the groping tape probably would have come out earlier if people had actually spent more time digging in the primaries. So I think that was one of the striking things to me this time around, was just the lack of resources and the ability to follow these people 24/7, cover them in the ways that we would have covered a traditional candidate. I think that the whole fake news thing and the whole kind of advent of fake news and the way things have changed Washington, I guess I would say that, yesterday I talked a little bit about disruption and how we're in a once in a 500 year kind of Gutenberg press disruption, and the same forces of disruption, I believe, are really affecting the media, and we're only sort of halfway through that, right? Nobody still has figured out how to make money off of the internet, and we're still trying to struggle to understand how to function in this time. I remember being in San Francisco a year ago or so, 2 years ago, and someone saying to me, "Oh my God, Jay, there's this great new startup that just got $30 million in funding for journalism." And I was like, wow, finally Silicon Valley's got a solution to this. And I was like, what's it called? And they're like, it's called Mike.com, and it's millennials talking into the camera about what they think about the news. And I was like, I don't think that that's journalism. And so there's just not a lot of solutions out there for like, how do you make money out of actual reporting and not opinion and not the echo chamber and not the kind of silos that we see. And there was a great Wall Street Journal op-ed probably in the spring of 2016 where they called on Facebook to to create an opposite button so that you could press the opposite button and like see what the exact opposite of people like of your feed were thinking, right? Like and reading and doing, because they, the journal sort of presently kind of worried that people were going too far down in their silos and getting too kind of echo chambery and not having a big enough open mind. And so I guess I mourn the loss of what my professors in journalism school used to call incidental news. And that is like when you open up the paper, even if you weren't that interested in what was going on in Paraguay, if there was an article about it, you might read the lead, you might like understand a little bit about it, and just sort of getting that incidental news from seeing other things. Now people self-select so much into what news they want delivered into their inboxes, they don't ever get the incidental news. They don't ever, and very few people actually self-select to read everything else, like the opinions they don't agree with, people's opinions who they, that they don't, that are the opposite of their own. And so, and that's an incredibly dangerous thing that I think is creating these silos of power and of knowledge and of interest in our country that is one of the major, I think, contributing factors to the problems we face today. And I don't really know how you solve it.
Jonathan?
So I'm going to pick up on the silos thing and say, for what Jay said, and the reason why fake news, as alleged by the president, has such power is because people are in their silos, and the people who support the president hear what he says and only hear what he says. I'm generalizing here. And so when he says fake news, they believe that all this stuff that he says the press is saying about him, they believe it. And that's why I think I said it yesterday, and I always, every time I get a chance to speak, is to tell people, and particularly, well, usually I'm speaking to liberal audiences, but occasionally I'll talk to mixed audiences. But I always tell people that if you're watching MSNBC or CNN, turn on Fox for a little bit. Get your news from as many different sources as possible. If you're only reading Frank Bruni, Gene Robinson, me, then you should also
But always read Jonathan.
Always read Capehart.
You really should.
After you've read my column, you should.
Maybe you can read somebody else.
You really should read a conservative columnist, Krauthammer, Ross. I can never pronounce his name. Doutat. At the New York Times, so that you can see what someone who doesn't agree with you says, if only to know what their arguments are, so you can figure out what the holes are and strengthen your own argument. But at least that way you become a more informed news consumer, but also a more informed citizen. In terms of where journalism is, Jay, coming from Time Magazine, in what she just described about Time closing, there's no Time presence in Asia, is sort of the glass half empty view of journalism right now, and it is very, very real. Coming from the Washington Post, I have a different perspective.
Owned by a billionaire.
So, before Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post with his own money, so Amazon does not own the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. From what is reported, he paid $250 million of his own money to buy the paper. And before that, the Washington Post was a publicly traded company. And so the first responsibility was to the shareholders. And so you have to be profitable. But what the Graham family found was that they had cut the paper to the bone so deeply that the actual functioning of the paper was in danger. So Don Graham got Jeff Bezos to buy the paper. And I remember when I saw the news that the Grahams were selling the paper, like everyone, I flipped out, because the Grahams weren't just the owners of the Washington Post. They believed in the Washington Post. Don Graham, when I started at the paper in 2007, the average tenure at the paper was about 15 years. Don Graham knew every person in the newsroom by name. By the time he sold the paper, like, the average tenure at the paper had dropped probably to about 5 years. There were a lot of young people around. Now, what Bezos has done is not only give the Washington Post the resources to staff back up, to hire more reporters, but he's also done things like make sure that not only do we have the reporters to report the news, but we also have the mobile designers and the video producers and the podcast producers and the web producers to make the news content attractive enough for people to want to read things at WashingtonPost.com.
Nice plug.
Gotta try. One of the things he kept talking about in his initial meeting with the newsroom, he kept talking about innovation. We have to try new things. We've got to do things to bring people in and be more innovative and more imaginative. And so one of the veteran reporters who had been through many other newsrooms where someone buys the paper, talks a good game about innovation, we're going to try new things, but it only lasted for maybe about a quarter. And then people would be let go, there'd be buyouts, people would be fired. And so there's a lot of nervousness at the paper about what is he talking about. So this reporter stands up and he asks, what do you mean by you're going to give us like a runway to do this? What is it? Like, what's your time frame, your horizon? And he said, oh, I'm talking years. Like, you need time to see if ideas work. And if it doesn't work, you do something else. You could feel the exhale in the audience, because that meant, wow, we actually can try and do new things. So at the Washington Post, it is the place pre-Trump, post Bezos buying it, but pre-Trump was already alive, was ginning back up, ginning back to life. Now in the newsroom, you don't just report. You are encouraged to do videos. And I'll just talk about my area because I'm on the editorial board. I write op-eds. I write a column. I do a podcast. If something breaks or they think that one of my columns would be a good video, I have to do a video. We have to multitask, we have to be imaginative, and we have to come up with ways to get people to read and watch our content. But we're juggling a lot of things at the same time. Now that during Trump's campaign, we had a lot of people in all sorts of areas covering Donald Trump. And I think now, and I'm, from what I've read, the New York Times is also seeing the same thing. Subscriptions are up, page views are up. People can't get enough of the Trump story. And as we've seen in these first 10 months or so, that the New York Times and the Washington Post are competing with each other. Their investigative teams just running down everything there is to know about this administration, from the Russia probe to the business dealings outside of the Russia probe, the hotel, the president's relationship with his workers vis-a-vis immigration. Both news organizations are really working their butts off, but at the Washington Post, there are a lot of people working their butts off to ensure that this administration is covered. The trust in the media before Donald Trump became president was already low. We are not a revered profession. We are not a respected profession, although I think we might be more popular than Congress.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we're back up to 42%.
Yeah, oh, 42%. That's great. But I do think that in this age of Trump, in this age where we have a chief executive who continually attacks the press, calls our reporting fake news, says that we are an enemy of the American people, encourages people to not trust us, turns his crowds against us at his rallies. If anything, I don't think that the press is cowed. The press is afraid of the president. I think those kinds of attacks reminds all of us, whether we are sitting in the briefing room at the White House, at those rallies that he does out in the country, or if we're sitting on editorial boards around the country, it only fortifies our belief in the First Amendment, our belief in our duty to the American people to be their eyes and ears of their government, and to stand up against a president who, in many, many ways, is doing a disservice to his office and to the country.
If I could just add something to what both Jonathan and Jay were saying, two points. One, while I'm not a journalist, my experience with journalists throughout my career has been such that while I can write a really, really good TV ad, like blasting the liberal media, it never in a billion years would have occurred to me ever to try to label what the media does as fake. And it may seem like a distinction without a difference, but there is a huge difference, because for decades, Republicans have complained about liberal bias in the media, but never actually painted the media as an institution as something that was fake, that was not to be believed. And my personal view, like we talked yesterday about, some of the things that Trump is doing that that people find alarming, or that are going to, what's going to have long-term impact on the country. I don't think that there is a single thing that is more pernicious that is going on with this administration than the war that is being waged on the news media. And the reason I believe that is because 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we have to have a shared collection of facts that everyone agrees on. They may not like the facts, but we have to be able to, as a nation, a democracy, we have to have a shared view that the sun rises in the east and the sky is blue. When you label the media as fake, just generically fake across the board, it completely undermines that collective sense of national unity that our country has, that has sustained us since our founding. And I'll give you just a very quick, short example of the impact that stuff like this is already having. I used to, as a political consultant, I used to sweat bullets about when TV ads that we wrote were being fact-checked, and whether it was PolitiFact, I remember arguing, going back and forth with PolitiFact editors, like doing everything that we possibly could to keep from getting like a pants on fire or, mostly untrue rating, or at the Post to do everything that we possibly could to keep from getting a bunch of Pinocchios, because that mattered.
They work.
Because I used to believe, because it used to matter, that if what you said was being labeled as untrue, that would have a detrimental impact on you vis-a-vis voters. Today, I could care less. You could say, we could put an ad out and PolitiFact could say pants on fire, totally false. We could get 7 trillion Pinocchios from the Post. And you know what? It's not going to matter, because the level of distrust that exists right now with what everybody is saying in the media is such that a campaign can simply say, yeah, well, what they said isn't. I stand by my ad, I stand by my statement, and who are you going to believe, me or them? And we're so siloed now that, the fact checkers, which used to have a real impact, it doesn't anymore. And I don't say this as, I'm not proud of the fact that I don't care about it anymore. I use that as an example to show this is the impact that waging a war against the media is having.
Can I follow on that just for a minute?
Absolutely.
I think we talked a little bit about this last night, Todd, and I think that for me, I'm less concerned about the future of news in the sense that I think fake news is not a new thing, and I think that we've been doing this for years, and like the advent of relatively balanced news and true news is a new thing, and that happened really in the last century. When we were founded since the beginning, basically, of the press, really, news was actually completely biased, was totally wrong. Like, you go back and look at the Revolution or in the Civil War, all of those media reports were hyperbolic. A lot of them were totally untrue, and you just had to, like, everything you read, you had to take with a grain of salt. And it's only been since the U.S. government stepped in the sort of early 20th century and said, you know what, we're going to make a public trust in news, and we're going to say news has to be balanced, it has to be given equal fair time to different candidates, to different kinds of coverage, international, national, and local, that it became something that was outside of the realm of profit. And I think that that's where Jonathan and the Washington Post lives, is, when you have a billionaire who owns you, you're outside of the realm of profit. You don't have to worry about making money on your clicks and on your ratings and things like that. Now, I
didn't go that far. I do believe Mr. Bezos does care, but it's not as big a thing as it was when the Graham's on.
But I would say that public trust in news was dismantled in 1987 after the 3 networks were bought by corporate interests. And 5 years after that, we had our first reality TV show, MTV's Real World. And it was, I think at that point, only a matter of time before you had an intersection of the ratings, huge hits of reality TV and of news, because both were nonfiction, both were real world, right? But one was for pure entertainment, and the other was for ostensibly information gathering and for education. But news now has become more often than not entertainment, and that includes especially Donald Trump. I mean, he is so good at entertaining us. Like, there is a reason why everyone buys the Washington Post and the New York Times and watches cable TVs, because they are so glued to this drama of the White House, of this, what's going to happen next, who's going to get fired, in cabinet bingo this week, and that's what's terrifying is, and I hope one day that, like, the show will jump the shark and people will be interested, not want to watch anymore. But until that happens, we are in this, bound to it. And I think the media is completely consumed by it until people stop paying attention.
John, I want to ask you.
We have another panelist.
Over here. Over here.
So I wanted to ask you, while we're on press coverage in the campaign, briefly, I've heard from various people that there was a view inside the Clinton campaign that the press wasn't treating her fairly, or the press wasn't treating her the same way that it treated others. How would you characterize the view toward the press from inside the Clinton campaign?
Well, listen, I think that I've been in this business, you've been in this business 30 years, all of us. I'm not sure that I've ever been in a campaign where we've felt that the press treated us fairly, right? I mean, let's start from there. I mean, you always kind of feel put upon. And I don't, whether you're a congressional or you're in a presidential, right? You never kind of feel like, oh man, they're
a Republican.
Yeah, right. Rob Hill at Thanksgiving. But I think that it goes deeper with someone like Hillary Clinton because of the history of the Clintons, in the White House, the troubles that they had, and then 2008, and that loss to Barack Obama in the primaries, kind of a rehabilitation when she went to state, et cetera, coming out of it with such a shining star, and then immediately starting her new presidential on a pretty high note, and then boom, in March of 2015, the email stuff comes. And, then you're kind of completely consumed. And so whether inside we felt like we were treated fairly or unfairly, it was the reality of what we dealt with from March 15 all the way to the very end, right? But, at the same time, if I'm being completely honest and, you take a look at Trump in the general election and things like the Hollywood access, I mean, can you say that wasn't treated fairly at that time? I agree with Jay. It probably, could have come out earlier and things like that. But I mean, it was everywhere, right? I mean, it was reported, ad nauseum. So, do we think that there was too much emphasis on the email thing? Yes. Do we think that in a sense that it stunted the ability for people to actually hear and see and consider what she was saying? Yeah, I think anyone probably saw that was a major obstacle. Do we think that we handled, it was handled well at the beginning? Those are always difficult decisions. Eventually the sweat broke on that when she gave the interview to Muir. But the fact is that these tensions with the press and the Clintons go back so far. I'm not so sure you would expect anything less. And I don't think we expected anything less. And I think that, the most difficult job, other than the candidate in the Hillary Clinton campaign, was Jennifer Palmieri, who was the communications director for 2 years almost. And, her life wasn't easy, and she was brilliant, I think, in terms of what she was doing in her staff. Because there was always an uneasy, if not hostile, relationship. The press can sit there, will have their side and say, well, Hillary was her own worst enemy. And, the campaign will say, hey, but we weren't being listened to and you made too much of a big deal about this, that, and the other thing. It's probably somewhere in the middle, but it has a history. And the problem with, the problem with anything like that is if there's a history that goes back at that point 25 years, that is not a great starting point. And, maybe it was naive on our part or the candidate to think, oh, well, because, she's running for president and she's out of the shadow of Clinton from like her husband, like it was in 2008, that you can hit a reset button and start all over. Maybe that, that probably was naive. Just like if you're in the press and you thought the access was going to be different this time, and you were disappointed because of it was probably naive. But you always got to go back to the history, and it was complicated, and it was long term, and there's certainly, I think, demerits on both sides in that relationship that's been a long time.
Could I add something to that? Just from my opinion writer perch, at 38,000 feet, and I wrote a column about this where I said, with Donald Trump during the primaries, no one took him seriously. I mean, he was the press, and by no one I mean the press. I mean, it was like, wow, here's this billionaire who's running for president, and he's saying these really incredibly insensitive, terrible, horrible, racist, misogynistic, sexist, nativist, xenophobic things. He can't possibly win. So, but he's great television. He's great copy. He's entertaining. So, excuse me. So we'll just cover him as if he's as an entertainer. So there was no standard for him. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, because of who she was and is, Hillary Clinton was covered like a potential president. She was covered at the presidential standard, which is where she should have been covered. She should have been asked the hard questions. She should have been reported on aggressively. But where the problem came in was that after the primaries and Donald Trump became the Republican presidential nominee, the press, from my perspective, took him half seriously instead of not seriously at all, half seriously because, well, this guy could become president, so we have to kind of take him seriously. But he said all those things during the primaries. He's saying all these things during the general election. Oh my God, there's the Access Hollywood tape. There's no way in hell this guy is going to become president. And yet, during the general election, Hillary Clinton is still being covered at the presidential standard, which is where that's how she should have been covered. And so she gets raked over the coals because of emails, because of the foundation, because of all these things. And yet on the other side, with Donald Trump, aside from Access Hollywood, where was the in-depth, aggressive reporting about the Trump organization, with the exception of David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post, there should have been more people covering his foundation, his philanthropic giving, his reputation in New York. There should have been more coverage about, well, why won't American banks loan money to a potential president of the United States? There are all sorts of questions that were never asked and never answered before Donald Trump became president. And so from my perspective, I completely understand the frustration of the Clinton campaign, although from a different angle, because if you're going to take brickbats in a two-person race, at a minimum, you want the person you're running against to get the same brickbats.
So can I add to that? I think that's a great perspective, but I would also say, and you may not agree, that she was held to the presidential standard in the primaries and Bernie wasn't. And I don't, I think that was actually, even at the time, the fact is that Bernie was treated again kind of like this interesting rock star, but he never got the scrutiny about his certain hypocrisy on his votes on guns or whatever, or some of the personal stuff, even with his wife in the college, etc. His votes, he was never, I don't believe, scrutinized at the same level because he wasn't considered presidential timber, although clearly he was catching fire. And so there was much more interest in the rallies and what he was saying and his implicit attacks on her. But I felt that he never got the scrutiny that he deserved, while at the same time she was going through a lot of things. And I'm sure there's people who disagree with that, but it reminds me that it wasn't only a Trump dynamic, that there was a primary dynamic that also went into play there. Now, of course, we were going through the email scandal at the same time, so I kind of get that.
Can I?
Normally when a candidate isn't being scrutinized by the media, it's because they're being ignored. And one of the biggest challenges that Ron and I both faced in the primary was that not only was Trump not being scrutinized, but he was being handed a megaphone by the media, particularly the cable networks, who would just cover all of his rallies, cover his speeches with almost no scrutinization of what he was saying.
With fanfare.
The best example I have of this is the most famous. We all knew within a couple of months of Trump running, or not even months, weeks, that he was going to make America great again, and that he was going to build a wall, and Mexico was going to pay for it. How much, Steve, for a corporate client, if you were going to have them do a national advertising campaign to pound into the heads of every American a slogan, but you were going to actually have to pay for it, how many hundreds of millions of dollars does that cost? It's astronomical. Trump got it all for free. Didn't spend a dime.
Jay, were you going to jump in?
I was just going to say, and looking at this from a woman's perspective, and I wrote about this during the campaign. Hillary was a very flawed candidate, and she has a lot of reasons on why she didn't win. But there is a gender aspect to this for sure, and that is, women who are running for executive office face a very different test than women who are running for legislative office or any other kind of office, and they have to prove that they're capable enough while not crossing that line over to becoming a bitch, right? And in Hillary's case, she proved she was capable in 2008, and she spent all of 2016 trying to make herself likable. And I remember going to a rally in New Hampshire, it was like a Hillary rally, but there was a 22-year-old girl who I asked, she was so eloquent. I was like, why are you voting for Bernie? And she was like, well, I've been to Hillary rallies and I've been to Bernie rallies. And she's like, if you think of going to a political rally like going on a first date, like, Bernie sweeps you off your feet. It's like revolution. It's like hugs and kisses. It's like, free healthcare, free college, free everything. It's awesome. And like, if you go to a Hillary rally, it's like going on a date with like an actuary. And that like, it's like really important what she's saying, but like, saving for college, paying your mortgage, but it's also really boring. And so, I think that there were those challenges. It's the same with Donald Trump on the other side. Like, he was like doing walls with Mexico and doing all these like, crazy ideas. Bernie had a $4 trillion healthcare plan. None of that was taken seriously, but with Hillary, you had to take it seriously. If you think about the women who've been elected to executive office in the world, they're all pragmatists. Like, they're all they don't soar rhetorically. They're not like crazy inspirational people. Like, Barack Obama could talk about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice every day, and everyone would be like, wow, that's so inspiring. For women, it's like Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, Dilma Rousseff. These are like the most pragmatic, get shit done people, on the planet. They're like very pragmatic, and they're forced to play this role of the kind of wife, spouse, like who holds the purse strings and says, no, Bernie, we can't afford that jet ski. We have to pay for college, and like, or whatever. And that is a role that's really, really hard to break out of and to become inspirational and soar.
Can I just say, I do find this always interesting. I would love your perspective on this, Jay. Is because I actually feel this constant narrative about Hillary being a flawed candidate, I actually think is gender bias, quite frankly. Because I think Donald Trump was a flawed candidate who won, right? No one ever considered him a flawed candidate because of all of these degrading things that he said, or all of his bad business practices, or you can go on and on and on. And that always seems to be the term about Hillary, the most experienced nominee in modern history. And I guess they're always talking about her personality. Maybe they're talking about her actions, but I actually think there's a gender bias in terming her flawed candidate, when a lot of flawed candidates who are male, like Donald Trump, it's you can win and lose. You can win and be a flawed candidate. You can lose and be a flawed candidate. But I'm always curious about what that means to political insiders.
So we're going to leave that for another day. Speaking of flawed candidates sometimes become flawed presidents. And my question, Ron, earlier you spoke about the party you love and the party you and Todd love. And you now have the party that you love headed by someone who doesn't share many of your views, and certainly doesn't reflect the kind of person that you are. What do you tell your students? So my question is this: at some point, the leader of the party becomes the symbol of the party, and the party starts to either resemble or become that person in the eyes of many voters. So as you look to 2018 and 2020, and Todd, as you look at your candidates in 2018 and 2020, Ron, what do you say to your students about the Republican Party that you love, that's headed by this man that they find to be so repugnant in so many ways? And Todd, how do you counsel your candidates who have to both at the same time sort of embrace the leader of the party and also distance themselves? And I want to start with Ron, because I think this is a question that probably is more difficult to deal with students and young people than it is probably old white guys in Alabama. I'm just guessing.
Thanks for that, Steve. It reminds me when I was here last year, and it was a week after the election, and as Ellen vividly remembers, there was a sense of shock, anger, really mistrust of what had happened in the political process. And I remember that we pulled a group of students together in the room right outside to the right and sat around the round conference table and said, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And let me get a sense of your perspective. And the perspective was, he's racist, he's sexist, he's all these things. And I said, okay, you can think that, you can believe that, but what are you going to do about it? You can elect to be angry, you can elect to be sad, you can elect to curl up in the fetal ball and sit in your room, or you could do something about it. You could get involved. You could register other people to vote. You can write your members of Congress. You can do something constructive with the energy that you feel that you have right now. And I fast forward a year later. So my students at NYU and DC, same thing. What in the blazes is going on? This ban, that ban, he said this and that. And I said, okay, you can do that, or you can make something positive out of that. And what we did last year, as Ellen vividly remembers, is I said, Paul Ryan's a dear friend of mine. You feel that you have no ally in the President of the United States. You feel you have no voice with the President of the United States. But you do have one in the Speaker of the House who is second in line. And if you have a vision, you have a message, you have a theme, you have criticism that you want to air with a high-ranking elected official, give it to me and I'll give it to him. And we sat down and we talked about that letter. And it was quite long. It was like 12 pages long of your colleagues who were here last year. And he got the message and he understood. So how do I counsel my students now, Steve? It's the same thing for what all of us do, that it's frustrating at times to be involved in politics, particularly in an unprecedented time and an era that we're living in now. But you can take your ball and go home and feel sorry for yourself, or that you can redouble your efforts and say, I'm not going to allow one party, one individual, one sentiment to ruin me or to anger me or to depress me. I'm going to use that to strengthen my resolve of who I am as a proud Republican, Steve, and recognize that we will get through this administration, we will get through this time, and folks like myself and Todd will redouble our efforts to make sure that our candidate's message gets out, that our policy vision gets out, and that we'll work even harder to make sure that we don't find ourselves in this spot again.
So Todd, how do you keep the Republican Party from being seen as either an extension of Trump or as a mirror of Trump?
It's ironic because we talked about this yesterday. For a president that has no set ideology and is certainly not someone that I would consider a conservative, his position in the White House is actually putting a premium on talking about ideas at the candidate level. And what I mean by that is the safest place for any Republican candidate to be right now, other than in a deep red state where you can just double down on support for Trump. But if you are in a purple state or a swing district, the safe harbor is to talk about policy, because center-right policies that were popular before Trump are by and large still popular. And so you can say, I'm going to support the president when I agree with him, and when I disagree with him, I'm going to work with him to try to move him in a more conservative direction. That is a message that you can deliver to primary voters who are going, for those that like Trump, they will appreciate the fact that that you're saying that you're going to work with the president, that you're going to support him. For those who don't like Trump, they will appreciate the fact that you're saying that when you don't agree with him, you're going to work with him to move him in a more conservative direction. And so it is, the safe harbor is you sort of take refuge in ideas, which I find ironic, but
Can I add to that? Because I actually, to what Todd's saying, I think the currency of the 2018 elections, because of what we're going through and what we see in focus groups, are actually going to be TV ads that are about policy and about values. They're going to be positive TV ads because it's the same thing of what the discussion we had about why the media isn't trusted at a high level, et cetera. Voters are now like, they're like Madison Avenue people. They don't trust anything. And I actually, they're dying for like people to tell them what they're for because of the dysfunction that we're in. And, Steve, you're in the media business and Todd's in the media business. I just think that the traction is going to be disproportionately positive versus all the negative and the contrast. Not that that won't be important, but I actually think you're going to see a lot of it because the other stuff isn't going to work.
So we wanted to make sure we left some time for student questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. We can keep chatting, or if there are questions, I'd like to go to some students. So stand up and I think there's a microphone.
Hi. Oh, wow.
Whoa. Hello.
Okay.
You need to come to karaoke.
So this is more so for Ron and Todd, especially just because the Republican Party has gained a lot of momentum because of the Trump phenomenon, but often at the sacrifice of the Republican Party's principles. How do you think that the Republican Party can remain competitive amongst the right-wing voter base without falling down this rabbit hole of racism and xenophobia and sexism?
Well, excellent question. First of all, we need to keep our promises, and we haven't. We've said that if you give us the House of Representatives, we're going to repeal Obamacare. If you give us the United States Senate, we're going to repeal Obamacare. If you give us the White House, we're going to repeal Obamacare. We have the largest governing majority right now since 1929, and so far as I can tell, everything that we pass out of the House goes to the graveyard in the Senate. And if you can't keep your promise to the American people, don't even talk about Trump. But if you can't, as an elected official, say, we've now been given the honor, the privilege, and the opportunity to govern, and we can't govern, then why should they trust us? I mean, Trump might be an albatross of some of the weird things that he says, but I think congressional leadership, sorry, Paul Ryan, sorry, Mitch McConnell, they're blowing it. And they're blowing a huge opportunity to show of if this is what a straight table of Republicans having a royal flush can do, then why wouldn't you give it back to the Democrats if they've proven the inability to govern? So it'll be very interesting for us heading into 18. And the timeline that we have, I might add to your question, we're running out of time. We get in the mode that Todd and I are so familiar with candidates of you're in giddy-up mode. Because once they get out of here for the holidays, we're already into reelect mode. And what do we have to put on the board? Nothing. Like congressional nothing. And so it's not so much Trump as we need to actually build a record in about 2 months. Otherwise, we're going to have a difficult 2018.
I think that whether you call it a tug of war or a civil war, however you label it, but the ongoing conflict between sort of the Bannon-Breitbart wing of the party and we'll say the sort of more traditional Reagan conservative wing, it's not going to go away in 2018, and it's not going to go away in 2020. When you have, unlike in a place like Italy, where you can have like 50,000 political parties, in the states where you have two, you have you're always going to have factions in both parties that are not representative of the whole, and the challenge is how do you manage that and don't allow the majority to be swallowed by the minority, which is sort of what happened this last cycle. So I don't know exactly how we're going to do it. I've been repeatedly wrong over the last 16 months or so about all things Trump. But I still am hopeful and optimistic enough to believe that ultimately that the Republican Party will remain the party of Reagan and center-right conservatism, and that this will be viewed as more of a blip.
As both John and Ron mentioned, both Trump and Bernie were able to gain so much ground because they were both this like anti-establishment candidates, and I wouldn't see this kind of craving for anti-establishment to just dissipate after this election, especially because Trump has proved that he is willing to continue this establishment ground and that kind of stuff. Do either parties plan on addressing this and kind of presenting voters with more quote-unquote trustworthy politicians or politicians that are more transparent? And if so, how?
You know, in some ways, I think that we can, you say anti-establishment, and I actually think of it a little different way. I don't think that, voters were saying, oh, just, he or she or he and he were establishing and non-establishment. I look at it at a much different level of they were tapping into the frustrations of voters, not just on the political system, but on the economic system. And I actually think that both Trump and Bernie, that their accelerant was tapping into a group of voters who had just been through, like a 6 or 7 year recession. And we tend not to dissect it that way or report it that way. And I don't mean media report it, but in terms of the analysis. And I think that the much deeper connection with voters happened to be on the economic frustrations, as well as disruption of the dysfunction in D.C. and dysfunction in Congress, and then these were the people who felt left out, and it was again deepened by coming off of a recession where they're seeing the economy moving, but they're not feeling like they're part of the economy. That it's all going to the top, it's all going to the corporations, it's all going to other people. At the same time, we're dealing with a real cultural identity in the United States where there's a group of people who were feeling left out, not only on the economic front, but that there were all these people who were put in front of them in importance, whether it was immigrants and whether it was refugees or whoever it was. Those are real feelings, and they're still there today. But I think it's much more about the economic frustration, about people not feeling that they're being heard or that they're first. There's there's no rallies for, the middle class, guy who was emasculated in the recession from Pittsburgh. There's no bumper stickers, there's no buttons. There's, what I'm saying? And I think that is still there. And so it's whether it's the establishment candidate or not, which I don't kind of buy into those, those labels. I think it's just whether a candidate can tap into those voter frustrations, whether it's Democrat or Republican. This is who will be successful, that I'm going to be on your side, and what we're going to do is impactful for you to make sure you have opportunities in the economic lane. And I think that's the big debate of 2018. I think that if Democrats go down this rabbit hole of believing this race is all about Trump, same thing with Republicans, et cetera, and don't talk to people where they live in their communities, in their economic lives, then we will have missed the boat again.
Let me agree with everything that John just said, except that I disagree with his terminology of establishment. I just remember going to a rally in Manchester, New Hampshire in October last year, and the same people that I saw at a rally for Donald Trump, it was a fascinating forum. It was an opportunity to see, Trump in action, and then you're in Manchester, there was Bernie, and there were several people that I saw at the Trump rally that were at the Bernie rally that they felt disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. And to your point of, they felt that the establishment isn't listening to us, they don't care about us, and we want something else. And I thought, wait, how in the blazes can you just have come from a Trump rally, and now you're at a Bernie rally? A good friend of mine, Tad Devine, was one of the senior officials in the Bernie campaign, said, you've got to come see this. And it's a phenomena I've never seen in politics in 26 years before, of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who felt disenfranchised and left out by the political party establishment. And to your point of, if Republicans and Democrats can't get their act together of tapping into this genuine sense of disgust and disdain with how politics as usual is going, then I think both parties are in trouble.
If I could just quickly add to what John was saying, and I'm glad that you brought up the economic crisis, because I don't think, as we've been dissecting this election, we probably haven't talked enough about that. But the seeds of Trump and Bernie and sort of the rise of populism, those seeds were all planted when the economy blew up.
Yeah.
You had it's very easy to forget sitting in Washington D.C. or certainly sitting here in a beautiful place like this. It's very easy to forget that it wasn't that long ago that millions of Americans woke up one day and their retirement savings have been wiped out, or the home that they purchased was now underwater, and so very real scar was left. I mean, that's real trauma that that people went through, and no one was ever held accountable for it. They watched it. You know, people forget, and Lord knows Republicans. This has all but been forgotten. But in the earliest days of the Tea Party, if you were to go to a Tea Party rally, about 2/3 of the signs that people were holding up, like the organic signs that they made at home with their Sharpies, 2/3 of them were Washington sucks, but 1/3 of them were Wall Street sucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Republican Party adopted the Tea Party movement, sort of forgot about the Wall Street sucks piece of it, focused on the Washington sucks piece. And so that level of populist anger at Wall Street, it's no surprise that someone like Trump comes along and he says, those guys on Wall Street are ripping you off. And he was the first one, at least on the Republican Party, on the Republican side, to talk like that. Yeah, there was a real audience.
And we see it in focus groups. I mean, there's literally a generation of white males between like 45 and 60, and, during that recession and after the recession, who truly felt emasculated, who non-college educated whites who had good jobs, either lost them or whatever, will never have those same type of jobs ever again, and feel like they've let their family down and their wives down and their kids. I mean, I almost can't stand to do male groups anymore because of that type of, what you're still feeling out there with that group. That, they saw their future kind of taken away. And again, I think emasculation is probably the best word to use in terms of what I have heard from them over the last 7 or 8 years in focus groups. It's concerning.
So thank your parents for letting you
Yeah.
come here. Yes.
So there was a lot of talk yesterday about House representatives and senators that will not stand up to Trump and will not hold him accountable for a lot of his words and a lot of his actions. So my question is mainly to Todd and Rob. Would you punish your own congressman in the ballots for not standing up to Trump, even if it meant going against your own party? Personally, and also, do you think Republicans are going to start voting against the people that have their seats right now for not standing up to the president?
Politicians are nothing if not public opinion entrepreneurs, and whether or not somebody stands up to Trump it is, I'm sad to say, but it is very rarely done solely out of principle, although there are some noted exceptions in the Senate. But if you are an incumbent senator from, I'll take Bob Corker. In the state of Tennessee, among Republican primary voters, Trump has a 94% approval rating. And so my job first and foremost as a political consultant is to help my candidates either be elected or get reelected. So no, I'm not going to counsel someone in an environment like that to stand up to Trump, because it's the surest, quickest way to get primaried and get taken out. That's just the reality.
I think Todd's exactly right. I'm going to take the cheap way out. So my congressman back home is Don Beyer for Virginia, and my two senators are Mark Warner and Tim Kaine. So for having all my elected officials, and my governor is Terry McAuliffe, so having all my elected officials be Democrats, I don't think I have to worry about having them stand up to Donald Trump, because I think they're going to do that anyway. But let me talk about, as Todd just said, of the candidates that I advise, and I'm advising for the 2018 cycle. And I'll give you one example of Dan Donovan from New York City. You know, the only Republican who represents New York City, but Staten Island was overwhelmingly pro-Trump. So how do you advise a candidate whose district was off the charts pro-Trump of, well, Danny, you need to stand up to Trump even though almost all of your constituents love Trump? And for me, it's taking a stand on principle. And one of the things that I advised him on that he took a lot of grief about was not supporting when the president said that he wanted to roll back some of the Medicaid expansion in his state, or in his healthcare plan. And I said, look how this is going to impact your district. Look at the disproportionate impact this would have on your district. Yes, they're pro-Trump, but what the president is asking you to take a vote on, Danny, it's going to hurt the very constituents who think that they're pro-Trump. And so he's picking his battles on issues rather than, I'm going to stand up to Trump and I dislike Trump for this and that. Because if he does that, and oh, by the way, he now does have, as Todd alluded to, a primary challenger who is backed by Steve Bannon for that very reason of they take one vote. You can be right 99.9% of the time. You take one vote on one amendment and one bill, and then all of a sudden Steve Bannon's merry band of thieves are out primarying you. It's a tough dilemma.
So you guys correctly identified polling as a reason why they don't. But that's not what they're ever going to say. And Jay and Jonathan, you guys speak to these Republicans in your capacity as journalists. And I'm sure that you speak to them periodically about why they aren't standing up more to some of the more outrageous things the president does. What do they tell you? How do they explain it? They're not going to say it's because of poll numbers. How do they explain it?
Well, so in the Capitol, in the Senate, there are these little trains that go underground from the Capitol offices to the Capitol. And every Tuesday, both parties have these lunches, and all the reporters in Capitol Hill stand by the trains and wait for the senators to get off the trains and go into lunch. And it has become this eye-rolling exercise every week where reporters will stand there and be like, so Trump said this today, Trump said this over the weekend, what do you think about what Trump said? And every senator, Republican senators in particular, play a game of dodgeball with us where they, try to find ways to be talking on their phone as they go through us, or they're like, oh, I'm really busy talking to my colleague, I can't really talk to you. And it's like their least favorite thing on the planet is to be asked about what they think about whatever it is that Trump said at that time. And a lot of people have really different ways to approach it. There's the game of total avoidance. There's the game of, and some people have stopped avoiding it. I mean, I think John McCain, increasingly, obviously, he's very sick. He's got brain cancer. He just doesn't care anymore. I mean, some people Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have been, and a lot of the women in the Senate have been much more open about their reservations about Donald Trump, and that's happened throughout the campaign. Others have vacillated. I mean, Richard Burr in the very beginning used to be very anti-Trump. I think he even told a conference luncheon that he'd rather vote for Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump, which he then had to apologize for later on. And obviously, as that's happened he's now the chair of the Intel Committee. He's been the chair of the Intel Committee for a while, and so he has to be much more careful in what he says because he's investigating the president. I think that it's a tough position for most of those members to be in because it's a catch-22. If you go hard against him, you're alienating that 35% of your own base that still support him. If you don't go hard against him on certain things, then you're alienating moderates and independents. And so they represent, they have to get reelected too. And so they have to tread the line and figure out in their districts and in their areas what makes the most sense for them to, in a calculated way, oppose or not. But it is a funny exercise.
And the only, and the only thing I would add to that, in addition to those cautions, they also have to worry about a president of the United States who is unafraid to attack them by name on Twitter and do so continuously, which then gets picked up by cable and then is run on a loop for hours on end until the next tweet against someone else. And so that just adds a whole other sort of firecracker to the dynamic that has members of Congress who are already skittish, as Jay talked about, extra skittish.
Well, also, I mean, it's not just polling, which Steve blames all of our, ills in this country.
Damn pollsters.
Polling or gerrymandering,
Right,
it's one or the other.
but there's case studies. I mean, if you're a sitting U.S. senator and you're a Republican, and you look at the two former U.S. senators, or one open seat, Kelly Ayotte, the two people who were most ardent against Trump in the 2016 elections were Kelly Ayotte. She stuck to her guns, and she lost in New Hampshire, and was it Joe Heck in Nevada in that open seat, and he lost. And then Martha Roby in Alabama, my congresswoman, who actually is a good friend of mine, Republican, she stuck to her guns against Trump and asked him to withdraw and all that type of stuff, and she got a write-in in 2006, literally a write-in candidate who got some ridiculous percentage, and now she'll probably get a primary challenge. So there's like case studies. They saw what happened if you do it. That I think is, listen, politicians are pragmatic, and that's not that's not a criticism. We're all fairly pragmatic in life. But they saw what happened to Ayotte and Heck and Martha, and I think that's,
And they want to get reelected.
And they want to get reelected. But I think that it's this dance, like Todd said. You want to get through these Republican candidates want to get through the primary. And then they're going to go back to, again, a general election universe, which I think Todd said yesterday. And you're going to hear a lot of, hey, I'm going to be with Trump when he's right. I'm going to be against Trump when he's wrong for my district or my state. You're going to see a lot of that, quite frankly, on both sides of the communication aisle.
I think it could be, maybe if folks are around this afternoon, we can play out this exercise, but you should all, you can play a little game where you pretend that you are, be a Republican political consultant for an afternoon, and you are representing a client who is running in a either a purple state or, let's say, a slightly center-right state. There are a bunch of candidates in the Republican primary. You have to win your primary before you can win your general. No one's ever heard of you, and your phone rings and it's Steve Bannon, and he wants to endorse your campaign. What do you say? The principled, I know everyone, of course, Steve Bannon, I'd hang up the phone, blah, 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 blah. Remember, you're a Republican political consultant. What do you say?
Tough question.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question. Oh, I don't know what to do.
Do speed rounds.
Or Steve, maybe have them all.
Okay, we'll do a lightning round, all three, but real fast answers.
Thank you very much. No, inside American politics is the topic, but we know that American politics doesn't only stay inside of the states, but also, we know about it internationally. And I'm just wondering, and primarily directing this to Jay and Jonathan, what the role of your international readership and the international public opinion in all of this?
The role of international public opinion, I guess, whether in the press or just broadly in the United States, the role of international public opinion, it doesn't exist. It plays no role. I mean, we are a very insular nation, as you well know. We really couldn't care less what the rest of the world thinks of us, whether President Trump is in office or anyone else. We love it when everyone loves us, but the fact that the British or the French or the Italian or the Australians or anyone from anywhere doesn't like what we're doing or doesn't like a particular candidate, we don't care. I'll just leave it at that.
I agree.
And that's not to say that's a good thing. It's just it is what it is.
Not only do we not care, but we will actually run campaigns attacking our opponent for caring too much about what people in Paris or Berlin think about them.
Now, remember what happened to then candidate Obama when he gave that big speech in Berlin. And the McCain campaign ran he's famous and look at the adoring crowds overseas, and they clubbed him over the head with that.
Yeah.
So this one's also for the journalists in the room, but we're living right now in a very binary-filled world where we have like these two extremist points of view, and you, Jay, you said that with the fact that you had to press this opposite button on Facebook and everything. So I'm just wondering, the media industry, they all they make this happen. They encourage this in a way by doing all these debates, and also like the way that they promote the tweets and everything, and all these fights that are happening. So I'm just wondering, do you think that they're looking at changing that and like trying to have the environment calm down a little bit, because otherwise we're looking at a divided 2020 election too?
I mean, I wish that we could separate out a lot of the wheat from the chaff in this case, and pay attention to policy. And every time I go on cable TV and talk about facelifts and WWE SmackDowns and like Steph Curry kneeling, I just feel like I'm contributing to like the miseducation of America, or the world, but it's I mean it's tough because we do get lost. I think we lose the forest of the trees all too often, and Trump is incredibly good at that. He's really, really good at masterminding that. As as we were saying yesterday, he's kind of his evil genius is to totally distract us with all these shiny toys and be like, oh my, look, Mika Brzezinski's facelift, and so it's until people stop paying attention to it, and until people's media doesn't need to make money from it, then I don't think there's going to be any change.
And I would just add to that, what I always try to do, and Jay does the same thing, even though we're talking about the shiny object, we always, in our answers, try to remind people about the fundamental issue at hand. So with the whole taking a knee thing, it's reminding people this is not about the anthem, not about the flag. Remember Colin Kaepernick, why he started kneeling. What was the fundamental issue? And that is a very real discussion that needs to be had. But instead, we're talking about what Trump is saying, the shiny object. But it's incumbent upon us in the press and those of us who go on television or on radio or have columns or podcasts to always try to bring the conversation back to the substantive, because there always is something substantive that is at stake that we're being distracted from.
A little bit similar. So do you think for the 2020 election that, how do you think the media will cover Trump? And do you think they'll exploit the popular Trump story, or will they have learned from the 2016 election?
I mean, I think right now what we're seeing, particularly from the White House press corps and then just news organizations in general, that they're covering him very seriously. He is going to face a different media landscape in 2020 than he encountered in 2016. Much more skeptical, much more antagonistic, much more in depth in ways that they just didn't do in 2016.
There will also be, anyone who's ever worked on political campaigns will tell you that re-elections are never as fun as as the first time around. When you run for office for the first time, it's all that you can be 100% aspirational. It's all about what you're going to do. When you run for re-election, you are now held to a standard of what did you actually do. And so to Jonathan's point, not only I think will the mindset be different in terms of the way that the media covers the president, but but just the dynamics are completely different in a reelect.
Todd's 100% right. I mean, I certainly remember working on the reelect for President Bush in 2004, and you're exactly right. They don't focus on the good things that you did. They focus on the war. They focus on unpopular. They hit you every single time, and John Kerry hit us every single time with every bad thing, wise or otherwise, that President Bush was perceived to have done. But with Donald Trump going into a reelect, I mean, you're looking at a guy who got billions of dollars of earned media by doing nothing other than picking up his smartphone and tweeting in 140 characters. I think he has changed the dynamic in a way that we've never seen. It'll be very interesting to see the Twitter president running for re-election and how much free earned media he gets. And if you're an opponent trying to break through, how do you break through? It's the suffocating, takes all the oxygen out of the room, takes all the light out of the atmosphere. How do you battle against that?
If I can make one last point and then I'll shut up. But I think that there is a decent chance, I'm not saying a majority chance, but there is an outside chance that that Trump doesn't run for re-election. And it would be, him doing that would be the ultimate FU to everyone who hates him. Because for everyone in this room that just hates Donald Trump, what you are all dying for, what you cannot wait for, is to see him get crushed in 2020. And if he denies you that opportunity, by not running and then spending the rest of his life talking about how overwhelmingly he would have been reelected,
So true.
had he run.
I actually think there's a double down FU, which is if he runs as an independent, which is a good chance, and then he Fs the Republican Party completely after destroying it, right? And then, changes the dynamics of American politics completely.
Okay.
We'll talk about that next year.
Yes. By the way, speaking of next year, if our late night revelry doesn't keep us from being invited back by Ellen, next year's conference would be after the election, and so I'm going to ask the 18th midterm. Yes, I'm going to ask everybody on this panel to just with one word for each, this for both the Senate and the House, who's controlling the House of Representatives, Democrats or Republicans, and who's controlling the Senate. Ron?
Republicans both.
Oh, I actually think it's going to be a wave election, and at the minimum, it's going to be the House Democratic split with the Senate. But there's a decent chance on the Senate.
I think Republicans by a hair will stay in control of both.
I try to stay out of the prediction game after my experience in 16. My heart wants to believe John, but given what I saw in 16, I would not be surprised if Republicans held on to the House and Senate, albeit with narrower majorities.
Jay, do women show up and take the Democrats over?
I don't know, but it's like Jonathan said, it's very hard to predict. I guess if the election were held now, they would keep the Senate and Dems would win the House.
I think Jay's right. Thank you all for coming.